Have you noticed how some people don't just enjoy being alone? They need it. The way lungs need air after being held underwater too long. The way silence feels less like emptiness and more like oxygen. You tell yourself you're just tired, just selective, just someone who values peace. Yet night after night you find your phone glowing in the dark while the world sleeps, scrolling through lives you no longer feel part of, cancelling plans with a quiet sigh of relief, letting messages sit unanswered because responding feels heavier than staying quiet. And in that stillness, there is a strange comfort. Not joy, not fulfillment, but safety. The kind that settles over you like a familiar blanket you learned to wrap around yourself long ago. You move through your days telling yourself you love your space, that people drain you, that solitude is your sanctuary, and sometimes it is. Silence can feel like a lake without ripples, a room without echoes, a place where no one can disappoint you, abandon you, misunderstand you, or leave you feeling exposed. Yet beneath that calm, there is often something unspoken moving quietly, like a shadow just behind the ribs. The knowledge that you didn't choose this distance as much as you learned it. You didn't wake up one day and decide that being alone would feel safer than being seen. It grew slowly, invisibly, the way a wall grows brick by brick until you forget what the other side looks like. Psychology has words for this, of course. Attachment styles, nervous system conditioning, the brain's relentless drive toward perceived safety. But none of those terms capture the way it feels in your chest when you hesitate before opening up, or the way your shoulders tense when someone gets too close. Neuroscience tells us that the brain remembers threat far longer than comfort, that the amygdala learns to associate connection with risk if closeness once came with pain. So instead of craving arms, you crave quiet. Instead of longing for voices, you long for silence. And the monster within, the one that whispers, "Stay alone," doesn't sound like fear anymore. It sounds like wisdom. You might tell yourself this is strength, that needing no one is power, that independence is a shield forged from self-respect. Yet, there are nights when the mask you wear so well begins to crack, when the room feels just a little too quiet, when the absence of messages feels heavier than their presence ever did. In those moments, you sense the garden inside you growing without water, surviving, yes, but not blooming. You feel the paradox tightening its grip. The thing that protects you is the same thing that isolates you. And somewhere beneath the habits, beneath the cancelled invitations, and carefully maintained distance, a quieter truth stirs uneasily. That this addiction to aloneness did not begin with your adult disappointments or broken relationships, but with a much smaller version of you who once learned, for reasons you barely remember, that it was safer not to reach out at all. Have you ever wondered how a child learns to go quiet before they ever learn how to ask for help? Long before you knew the language of independence or the armor of self-reliance, there was a smaller version of you standing in a room that felt just a little too empty, watching adults move in and out like weather patterns that could not be predicted. You didn't grow up in obvious chaos. There were no dramatic storms that left visible wreckage. What shaped you was far quieter than that. The missed glances, the distracted answers, the moments when you reached out with something fragile in your hands and learned, slowly, that it would not always be received. The brain, especially a child's brain, does not need cruelty to feel unsafe. It only needs inconsistency. You learn that expressing need could lead to disappointment, that emotions might be met with silence, impatience, or unpredictability. One day, affection was warm and abundant. The next, it was distant, unreachable. So your nervous system adapted the only way it knew how. Attachment theory would later call this an avoidant pattern, but as a child, it simply felt like learning how to disappear without anyone noticing. Your body discovered that loneliness hurt less than rejection, that being self-contained felt safer than being exposed. Like a plant learning to survive with very little water, you adjusted to the drought instead of expecting rain. Neuroscience tells us that a child's brain wires itself around whatever keeps it alive emotionally. Each moment of emotional invalidation, each unreturned look, each unanswered question trained your amygdala to associate closeness with uncertainty. Over time, your body learned the lesson more deeply than your mind ever could. Connection is unpredictable, but distance is stable. So you became small inside, you stopped reaching, you learned to sit with yourself in rooms where no one came looking, and you told yourself you were fine. The shadow was born there, quietly, not as a monster, but as a protector. Later, when you began to grow, people looked at you and saw a child who didn't need much, who didn't cry too loudly, who seemed mature for your age. They did not see the mask forming, the one meant to hide how deeply you had learned to survive alone. Inside, unmet attachment needs collected like unsaid words, like messages you kept drafting but never sent. The garden within you continued to grow without water. Alive, yes, but thirsty in ways you couldn't yet name. And so loneliness shifted from being something that simply happened to you into something that felt chosen, even necessary. It became the place where you could breathe without waiting for someone to leave. What began as a response to quiet emotional absence slowly hardened into a rule for living. Don't reach out. Don't need too much. Don't get too close. You carried that rule forward without realizing it, polishing it into strength, into identity, into personality. And as you stepped into adulthood, that early survival strategy did not fade away with childhood. It followed you, reshaping how you attach, how you love, how you pull away, becoming not just something you learn to do, but someone you learn to be. Have you noticed how easy it becomes to call your retreat a personality once you've worn it long enough? Somewhere along the way, the child who learned not to reach out grows into an adult who says, almost casually, "I just don't like people that much," as if it were a preference rather than a protection. You cancel plans without hesitation. You ignore calls with practiced calm. You feel your chest tighten not at the thought of being alone, but at the idea of being expected. And each time you step back into your quiet, it feels like putting on an oxygen mask you don't even remember choosing. A quiet breath of relief that tells you, once again, you are safe here. To the outside world, this looks like confidence. It looks like strength. You seem independent, self-contained, unbothered by the noise of relationships and the chaos of emotional closeness. But inside, the story is rarely so clean. When someone gets close, when a relationship begins to ask something real of you, your body often reacts before your mind can catch up. You grow distant without meaning to. During conflict, your words dry up. You shut down not because you don't care, but because caring feels overwhelming, like standing too close to a fire you once burned yourself on. Psychology would describe this as the adult manifestation of avoidant attachment, a nervous system trained to associate closeness with emotional risk. Neuroscience shows how repeated early experiences shape neural pathways that equate distance with safety. So when love appears, your shadow steps forward first, not as a villain, but as a guardian. It whispers that you don't need anyone, that needing is weakness, that closeness is a trap disguised as warmth. And you listen, not because you are broken, but because this voice once kept you alive. You become a lighthouse in the dark, visible from far away, impressive in your solitude, guiding others without ever allowing them to dock. People are drawn to your mystery, to your self-possession, to your quiet gravity. But when they drift too close, you pull back into the fog, leaving them unsure of what they ever touched. Inside, the garden continues to grow without water. You tell yourself you don't need it. You tell yourself you thrive on drought. Yet some part of you still remembers what rain would feel like. There is a crucial difference between healthy introversion and compulsive emotional isolation, though the two often wear the same mask. Healthy solitude restores you. Compulsive aloneness protects you. One is chosen, the other is inherited. One leaves space for return. The other quietly builds walls without asking. And in the private moments when your avoidance costs you something you secretly wanted, a closeness that faded too quickly, a connection that never deepened, a question begins to echo beneath the identity you've built so carefully. Is this who you truly are? Or is it who you learn to become in order to survive? Have you ever wondered why your body relaxes in isolation but tightens in closeness, as if your nervous system speaks a different language than your heart? Long before you formed beliefs about independence or strength, your brain began quietly rewriting its definition of safety. Attachment theory tells us that when early connection feels inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, or unpredictable, a child's nervous system adapts by turning inward. What begins as protection slowly becomes preference. By adulthood, this adaptation often wears the mask of avoidant attachment, but beneath that label lives something far more intimate, a brain that learned to survive by staying unreachable. Neuroscience explains that your amygdala, the small, ancient structure that scans relentlessly for danger, does not distinguish between physical threat and emotional risk in the way the mind does. To your nervous system, rejection can feel like falling. Abandonment can feel like extinction. So when closeness approaches, your body reacts first, sending signals of tightness, restlessness, and unease before you have time to think. But when you return to solitude, when the door clicks shut and the world fades, dopamine releases softly through your system as relief. Not happiness, relief. The chemical whisper that says, "You are safe again." Loneliness becomes chemically soothing, even when it hurts. This is how hyper-independence is born, not as a personality trait, but as a trauma adaptation. Emotional self-reliance feels strong on the surface, but underneath it lives a nervous system that no longer expects comfort to come from outside. Dissociation becomes an unspoken skill, the ability to go quiet inside during emotional intensity, to disappear while remaining physically present. You do not shut down because you do not care. You shut down because caring once felt like danger. Over time, the monster within grows quieter and more convincing. It does not roar, it reasons. It tells you that needing others is unnecessary, that closeness only complicates things, that solitude is clarity. Meanwhile, the garden inside you continues to grow without water, leaves curling inward not from neglect but from learned drought. This is the paradox the avoidant nervous system carries. Isolation feels calm, but beneath that calm lives hunger. Studies on emotional regulation show that avoidant individuals experience intense internal arousal during moments of intimacy that they rarely express outwardly. You may look composed, unbothered, even detached, while your nervous system quietly scrambles beneath the surface. So you retreat. You regulate yourself through distance. You build a world where no one can become essential, because essentials can be taken away, and for a long time this works. You survive, you stay functional, you stay protected, but slowly, almost invisibly, the protection begins to transform into something heavier. What once kept you safe begins to confine you. The nervous system that learned to guard you now guards the very loneliness that is starving you. And this is where the darker question begins to rise, not in theory, but in feeling. When safety becomes a cage you no longer question, how do you even recognize that the door was never locked, only learned? Have you ever noticed how the quiet that once felt like shelter can slowly begin to echo like a locked room, with soft walls, padded enough to keep out pain, yet firm enough to keep you inside? From the outside you seem calm, composed, untouched by the chaos that entangles others. But inside there is often a quieter struggle unfolding, the ache of wanting connection without trusting it, the yearning for closeness shadowed by the certainty that getting close will cost you something you may never recover. You crave warmth, yet flinch at the fire. You may find yourself standing at the edge of relationships, drawn in by laughter, by shared moments, by the promise of being known, only to feel that familiar tightening in your chest when it becomes real. When the other person reaches toward your inner world, your shadow moves first. You withdraw your hand, you retreat into silence, not because you don't care, but because caring feels like walking barefoot through something you once learned to fear. The monster within does not attack, it cautions. It whispers that distance is cleaner, safer, quieter. There are nights when this choice weighs more than you expected. You scroll through faces you no longer see. You replay conversations that never quite became what they might have been. In relationships, you may feel like a lighthouse surrounded by unbridgeable water, visible, dependable, admired from afar, yet impossible to reach without risking everything. People come close, then drift away, confused by the walls they can sense but cannot touch, and with each departure your belief grows stronger. See, this is why you stay alone. Psychologically, this is the paradox of the avoidant shadow. Emotional walls are built to keep out pain, but they do not discriminate. They block sorrow and joy with equal devotion. The nervous system that once learned to survive by refusing closeness now confuses survival with starvation. The garden inside you grows wild without human footsteps, alive but unattended, resilient, yet aching for something it does not know how to ask for. You may feel resentment surface quietly when you watch others lean into love so easily, mistrust blossom when someone tries to get close, and a loneliness that feels heavier precisely because no one can see it. You have taught yourself to carry everything alone, and now the weight has become familiar, even when it bends your spine. There is grief here, though it rarely screams. It hums, it waits, it lingers in the spaces between your independence and your longing. And perhaps the most haunting realization comes softly, not as a revelation, but as an ache you cannot quite name. The same shield that once protected you from being hurt has perfected its grip so well that it now quietly starves you of the very nourishment you were built to need. You are safe, yes, but safety without connection begins to feel like standing still while life moves past you. And as this truth settles in your chest, another question begins to rise, quietly from beneath the armor, preparing the ground for what comes next. When loneliness becomes a cage rather than a choice, what kind of world taught you to confuse isolation with strength? Have you noticed how the world claps loudest for the ones who say they need no one? Somewhere along the way, independence stopped being a skill and became a virtue that borders on worship. You are praised for being self-sufficient, admired for being unbothered, respected for carrying everything alone, as if your ability to suffer quietly were a form of success. The culture you live in romanticizes the lone figure who never leans, never asks, never breaks. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to confuse isolation with strength, detachment with maturity, and emotional distance with control. You see it everywhere. Productivity culture celebrates the one who keeps going without rest, without support, without softness. Emotional minimalism teaches you to protect your energy by cutting people off rather than learning how to stay while setting boundaries. The myth of the strong individual floats through every screen you touch, telling you that dependence is weakness and closeness is a liability. Even love is often framed as something that should never cost you discomfort, and so your mask is not only allowed, it is applauded. Digital life deepens this illusion. You can talk to hundreds without touching one's soul. You can disappear without anyone truly noticing. You can curate presence without vulnerability. The nervous system that once learned to associate closeness with danger now finds endless justification for staying distant. Neuroscience shows that quick bursts of digital stimulation can temporarily quiet loneliness without ever challenging it. Your brain gets enough signal to avoid feeling abandoned, but never enough warmth to feel held. The garden within you remains alive, but unwatered. Philosophically, this age worships the idea of the self-made person, untouched by need, unshaken by loss, entirely self-contained. Individualism promises freedom, yet often delivers a quieter kind of exile. You are told to be your own home, your own support, your own source of safety. And while there is power in that, there is also something deeply inhuman about believing you were never meant to be carried, even for a moment. So when you withdraw, when you retreat behind your emotional walls, the world does not question it. It validates it. It calls you focused, mature, unproblematic. No one asks what taught you to become unreachable. No one asks what fear is being preserved beneath the discipline. The shadow grows more convincing because it is no longer just yours. It is cultural, it is shared, it is rewarded. Yet in the quiet moments when the applause fades and the screens dim, a different truth pulses beneath the identity you've been praised for. The same society that celebrates your independence does not sit with you in the nights when independence turns into isolation. The same voices that admired your detachment do not feel the weight of your unshared grief. You become strong in public and starved in private, and this is the invisible price the world rarely names. When emotional distance is praised more than emotional courage, You learn to perfect the wall instead of healing what built it. And beneath that admired independence, beneath the image of the unbothered self, the question begins to ache quietly. What does it truly cost to be celebrated for needing no one at all? Have you ever wondered why the loneliest moments are often the ones no one would ever suspect, the ones that arrive quietly while your life looks perfectly intact from the outside? You move through the world appearing calm, self-contained, even peaceful, yet inside there is often a constant low-humming ache that never fully leaves. Chronic loneliness does not always feel like dramatic sorrow. Sometimes it feels like emotional numbness, like walking through your own life slightly removed from it. You laugh at the right moments, show up when expected, but something essential inside you remains untouched, as if your heart learned to dim its own lights to avoid being hurt by the dark. In relationships, anxiety rides silently beneath your composure. When someone leans in emotionally, your body stiffens before your mind can make sense of it. You may feel overwhelmed after moments of closeness, needing distance the way others need reassurance. Attachment theory describes this push-pull tension as the residue of a nervous system that never felt safe being held too long. And so even love, when it appears, carries a trace of fear. You want to stay, yet part of you is already planning the exit. There is grief here, though it rarely announces itself. It lives in the empty rooms you return to at night, in the messages you type and never send, in the celebrations you experience alone when no one witnesses your becoming. You watch others build lives together, shared homes, shared memories, shared futures, while you hover just outside the frame, present yet strangely absent. The world continues inviting you in, and you continue standing at the door with your hand hovering over the handle, unsure whether to turn it. Depression often hides behind your peace like a shadow behind glass. On the surface, your solitude looks intentional, even wise, but beneath it, there is exhaustion, the tiredness that comes from carrying every fear, every loss, every doubt alone without ever letting the weight rest in someone else's hands. You have become so skilled at self-containment that you no longer remember what it feels like to be carried, even for a moment. Resentment sometimes flickers quietly when you see how easily others lean on one another, how openly they depend, how freely they risk. You tell yourself you do not need what they have, yet the garden within you still grows without water, alive but thirsty in ways you have learned not to name. The monster within does not shout anymore, it simply endures, whispering that this is the cost of safety. And yet, beneath all this quiet weight, a fragile truth begins to stir. What feels like destiny may actually be memory. What feels like identity may be adaptation. The loneliness you carry into adulthood was once a language you learned to survive childhood, not a sentence you were born to serve forever. And as that realization begins to settle, a softer question emerges through the ache. If this isolation was learned, then perhaps slowly and tremblingly, it can also be unlearned. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to let someone close without feeling as though you were giving up your entire identity in the process? Healing does not begin with dramatic confessions or sudden transformations. For someone who learned to survive alone, change starts much more quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the way you begin to notice your own inner weather. Emotional awareness is the first unguarded step. You start to sense when your body retreats before your mind agrees, when the mask slides into place automatically, when the shadow tightens its grip not out of cruelty, but out of habit. Neuroscience tells us that the nervous system can be retrained through repeated experiences of safety, not through force. You do not heal by flooding yourself with closeness all at once. You heal by choosing micro-connections that do not overwhelm your defenses, small moments of honesty, brief stretches of openness, low-risk acts of trust that show your body it will not be punished for softening. A conversation that ends safely, a boundary that is respected, a need that is voiced and not rejected. Each moment becomes a drop of water in the garden that learned how to survive drought. Reparenting the inner child is not a metaphor meant to sound poetic. It is a lived psychological process. It means offering yourself the consistency you once needed from others. It means learning to sit with your own fear without shaming it, reassuring your nervous system that closeness does not automatically mean loss. The monster within does not disappear when challenged. It softens when it is no longer needed. Boundaries, in this light, become bridges rather than barricades. Instead of withdrawing completely when closeness becomes uncomfortable, you begin to communicate where your limits are without disappearing behind them. This is how emotional self-reliance slowly transforms into emotional regulation. You no longer shut down to survive. You pause to choose. Solitude does not need to be abandoned for connection to grow. It can remain a sanctuary, a place of rest, a quiet room you enter by choice rather than by fear. The difference is subtle but essential. A sanctuary is something you return from. A prison is something you disappear into. When solitude becomes a choice rather than a reflex, it no longer defines you. It simply supports you. Slowly, trust begins to rebuild, not as blind faith, but as a quiet tolerance for uncertainty. You tolerate the discomfort of being seen. You tolerate the vulnerability of being missed. You tolerate the ache of needing without condemning yourself for it. Independence and connection stop being enemies wrestling for control of your heart. They learn, gradually, to share the same space. And perhaps the most powerful realization comes not with relief, but with resolve. Healing is not about becoming dependent on others in the way you once feared. It is about becoming free from the rule that told you must never need anyone at all. Have you ever wondered why the people who seem most at peace in their solitude often carry the heaviest histories of learning how to endure without being held? There is a strange poetry in that contradiction. Those who appear strongest alone are often those who were asked far too early to become their own shelter. You learned how to quiet your own hunger for closeness, not because you didn't need it, but because needing it once felt unbearable. And so solitude stopped being a choice and became a discipline, a ritual of protection practiced so often that it began to feel like identity. The world may tell you that this makes you rare, powerful, untouchable, but the truth is softer and far more human. Addiction to solitude is not the love of loneliness. It is the fear of loss rehearsed in silence. It is the quiet vow you made to yourself somewhere along the way that you would never again reach for something that could disappear. You did not fall in love with emptiness. You fell in love with the promise that emptiness could not abandon you. Psychology tells us that the nervous system never forgets the first places it learned how to survive. Even when the danger is gone, the reflex remains. So you continue to choose distance even when closeness is gentle. You continue to wear the mask even when no one is attacking you. The shadow steps forward even when the light is safe. And yet, beneath all of that adaptation, there is still a human heart that was never built for isolation, only trained for it. You were not meant to bloom in sealed rooms forever. You were not meant to carry every season of your life alone, no matter how well you learned to do it. The garden within you did not grow thirsty because something is wrong with it. It grew thirsty because it was always meant to be watered by something beyond itself. Connection is not a weakness your independence must outgrow. It is a need your independence can finally walk beside without fear. The bravest thing for someone who learned to survive without being held is not walking away. It is turning back, not recklessly, not blindly, but with trembling awareness. It is letting someone see you before your armor is fully in place. It is allowing yourself to be missed. It is choosing again and again to step toward closeness without demanding certainty that you will never be hurt. That is not weakness. That is courage in its quietest form. You do not heal by abandoning solitude. You heal by freeing it from the job of being your only refuge. You allow it to be rest instead of exile, silence instead of hiding, space instead of distance. And in doing so, you begin to discover that you can be alone without being abandoned and connected without being consumed. Because in the end, the deepest truth is not that you learned how to survive alone. It is that survival was never the point. You were never meant to merely endure. You were meant to be witnessed and to learn, trembling and uncertain, that being held is not the same thing as being lost.